Section 1.5. Packer'S Models of the Criminal Justice System. Every matter of controversy in criminal justice has as its core at least two competing sets of ideas. For instance, consider a criminal trial. The prosecutor presents a case that represents the interests of the state, one that is designed to prove that the defendant is guilty and should be held accountable for the crime with which he or she is charged. In contrast, the defense attorney presents a case in the interest of his or her client. The defense attorney attempts to raise doubt about the defendant's guilt and insists that the legal procedures designed to protect the defendant's rights be followed. The competing sets of values that each of these actors brings to the table, and that are found at all other stages of the criminal justice process as well, have been described by Herbert Packer as the crime control and due process perspectives. Packer's models of the criminal process are just that, models, and not depictions of reality. He sees them as the two ends of a continuum along which the actual operation of the criminal justice system will fall. He also cautions against depicting one model as the way things work and the other as the way things ought to work. In his words, the two models represent an attempt to abstract two separate value systems that compete for priority in the operation of the criminal process. The value systems that compete for priority are regulating criminal conduct and preventing crime, which the crime control model views as the most important function of the criminal process, and protecting the rights of individuals, which the due process model emphasizes. In the sections that follow, we describe the crime control and due process models in detail, focusing on their differences. A. The crime control model. As its name suggests, the crime control model views controlling crime as the most important function of the criminal justice system. The primary function of the system is to control crime by catching, convicting, and punishing those who break the law. Failure to control crime, according to this perspective, leads to a breakdown in public order. If citizens believe that laws are not being enforced, they will have fewer incentives to obey the law, which will lead to an increase in crime and to a greater risk of victimization among law-abiding citizens. According to the crime control model, efficiency is the key to the effective operation of the criminal process. A high proportion of offenders whose offenses become known must be apprehended, tried, convicted, and sentenced. Moreover, this must be accomplished in a system where the crime rate is high and resources for dealing with crime are limited. Thus, the model emphasizes speed, which depends on informality and uniformity, and finality, which means that there should be few opportunities for challenging outcomes. The requirement of informality means that cases should be screened by police and prosecutors to determine the facts and to separate the probably innocent from the probably guilty. Judicial fact-finding, which is more time-consuming and thus less efficient, should be the exception rather than the norm. Uniformity means that officials should follow routine procedures in most cases. The metaphor that Packer uses to describe the operation of the criminal process under the crime control model is that of an assembly line. As this suggests, the goal is to move cases through the justice process as swiftly as possible. Suspects who are probably innocent are screened out early in the process by police and prosecutors. Those who are probably guilty are moved quickly and perfunctorily through the remaining stages in the process and are convicted, usually by a plea of guilty, as expeditiously as possible. Thus, the system achieves the goal of controlling crime by separating the innocent from the guilty early in the process, by extracting early guilty pleas from those who are not screened out by police and prosecutors, and by avoiding trials. A key to the operation of the crime control model is the presumption of guilt, which rests on a belief in the reliability of the screening process operated by police and prosecutors. That is, defendants who are not screened out early in the process by police and prosecutors are probably guilty and therefore can be passed quickly through the remaining stages in the process. The presumption of guilt is simply a prediction of outcome. Those not screened out early in the process are probably guilty and more than likely will plead guilty or be found guilty at trial. The presumption of innocence, on the other hand, means that until the defendant has been adjudicated guilty, that person must be presumed innocent and must therefore be afforded a number of due process protections to ensure he or she is treated fairly. In summary, the crime control model views the apprehension and conviction of criminals as the most important function of the criminal justice system. It characterizes the criminal process as an assembly line that moves cases forward in a uniform and predictable way. The model places great faith in the reliability of fact-finding by police and prosecutors. It suggests that the process is operating with maximum efficiency if cases involving the probably innocent are screened out early by police and prosecutors, and if the rest of the cases, which involve defendants who are presumed to be guilty, are disposed of as quickly as possible, preferably with guilty pleas. B. The due process model. Whereas the crime control model views the criminal process as an assembly line, the due process model sees the process as an obstacle course. Each stage in the process is designed not to move cases forward as expeditiously as possible, but rather to throw up hurdles to carrying the case from one stage to the next. There are other differences as well. Where the crime control model stresses efficiency, the due process model stresses reliability and minimizing the potential for mistakes. And where the crime control model places great faith in the ability of police and prosecutors to separate the probably innocent from the probably guilty, the due process model contends that informal, non-adjudicatory fact-finding carries with it a strong likelihood of error. It is important to point out that the values underlying the due process model are not the opposite of those found in the crime control model. Like the crime control model, the due process model acknowledges the importance of controlling crime. However, the due process model rejects the premise that screening of cases by police and prosecutors is reliable. More to the point, the due process model stresses the likelihood of error in these informal screening processes. Because of the strong possibility of mistakes in the early stages of the process, the due process model calls for fact-finding procedures that are formal, adjudicative, and adversarial. The case against the accused, in other words, should be publicly heard by an impartial tribunal and evaluated only after the accused has had a full opportunity to discredit the case against him. The model also rejects the notion of finality. Rather, there should be constant scrutiny of outcomes to ensure that mistakes have not been made. There also are sharp differences between the two models in the degree to which mistakes can be tolerated. That is, there are differences in the weight given to reliability, a strong probability that factual guilt has been determined accurately, and efficiency, expeditious handling of the large number of cases that the system takes in. The crime control model is willing to sacrifice some reliability in pursuit of efficiency. It tolerates mistakes up to the level at which they interfere with the goal of preventing crime. If too many guilty people go free, or if there is a general view that the system is not reliable, crime might increase rather than decrease. The due process model rejects this view, arguing that mistakes must be prevented and eliminated. To the extent that efficiency requires shortcuts that reduce the reliability of outcomes, efficiency must be sacrificed. To ensure a high degree of reliability in the process, the due process model requires that both factual guilt and legal guilt be proved. Factual guilt simply means that the evidence shows that there is a high probability that the defendant committed the crime of which he or she is accused. Legal guilt, on the other hand, refers to the process by which determinations of guilt are made. Defendants are not to be deemed guilty unless all of the mandated procedures and rules designed to protect the rights of the accused have been followed. A defendant charged with an assault that was witnessed by a number of bystanders who are willing to testify against him may well be factually guilty of assault. His legal guilt at the time of charging, on the other hand, is an open question. If the determination of factual guilt is not made in a procedurally correct way, the defendant is not legally guilty and cannot be held accountable for the crime with which he is charged. The due process model, then, resembles an obstacle course in which cases must navigate hurdles set up to ensure that determinations of guilt are reliable. The key to this is formal, adjudicative, and adversarial fact-finding procedures with constant scrutiny of outcomes to ensure that mistakes have not been made. Defendants are presumed to be innocent until proven guilty, legally as well as factually. In an ideal world, judges and other criminal justice officials would balance due process and crime control ideals. They would strive for efficiency while insisting on reliability. In the real world, this is probably not possible. Many decisions tip in one direction or another. High caseloads, limited resources, and concerns about protecting the community may lead to shortcuts that threaten reliability or to decisions that chip away at the procedural regulations that protect the rights of criminal defendants. Similarly, concerns about restraining the power of criminal justice officials may lead to decisions that make it more difficult for the criminal process to apprehend and convict those who commit crimes. A good example of an issue where use of the crime control and due process models would lead to different conclusions is plea bargaining. According to the crime control model, the criminal process is operating most efficiently when defendants who are not screened out by police and prosecutors plead guilty at the earliest possible moment. The criminal process would break down if too many defendants insisted on taking their cases to trial. The crime control model thus sees nothing wrong with allowing prosecutors to reduce charges or drop counts in exchange for guilty pleas, or permitting judges to make it clear to defendants that those who plead guilty will be treated more leniently than those who insist on a trial. Although plea bargaining may result in guilty pleas by those who are innocent, this type of mistake is likely to be rare, as those who have survived the screening process are in all probability guilty. Disposing of a large proportion of cases as quickly as possible via guilty pleas is, according to this model, the only feasible means of achieving the goal of crime control. It is no surprise that use of the due process model leads to a different conclusion. According to this model, guilty pleas, which effectively preclude any oversight of the early, informal stages of the process, should be discouraged. The due process model values reliability and contends that mistakes are likely early in the process. Because of this, a guilty plea that occurs soon after the prosecutor makes a decision to charge someone with committing a crime has a high probability of producing unreliable factual determinations of guilt. In addition, the model would not allow prosecutors or judges to promise defendants leniency in return for a guilty plea. Defendants, no matter how overwhelming the evidence, have the right to have the charges against them tried using the procedures required by law. They should not be coerced to enter a guilty plea or punished for exercising their constitutionally protected rights. Moreover, before accepting a guilty plea, the judge adjudicating the case should be required to both establish the defendant's factual guilt and ensure that the process that brought the defendant into court has been free of mistakes. According to the due process model, it is only by following these rules that reliability of outcomes can be guaranteed and mistakes minimized.